1892, Mayfair, London. The Merrick townhouse rose like a monument to obligation rather than affection, its golden ballrooms and glittering chandeliers designed to dazzle society, never to shelter warmth. For stories of marble and mahogany stood as testimony to 3 generations of Merricks who valued reputation over tenderness, duty over devotion. Callum Merrick moved through those gleaming halls like a man conducting business, every gesture measured, every word calculated. He had inherited not just wealth, but the family conviction that marriage was merger, love was liability, sentiment was weakness. Servants spoke in hushed tones when he passed. Business partners adjusted their proposals before meetings. Even the crystal seemed to hold its breath in his presence, aware that emotion had no place in the world he commanded. Iris had been his wife for 4 months. Not his love, not his confidant, not even his companion in anything beyond name. She existed in the townhouse the way candlelight exists in a ballroom, present but unnoticed until darkness threatens. The staff addressed her with respectful courtesy, but the mirrors knew the truth. She was a stand-in, chosen for her impeccable lineage and convenient desperation, a woman to occupy the title of Viscountess until he found a wife worthy of his dynasty. Iris had understood the terms from the beginning. There had been no romance, no promises beyond the legal vows required. He'd assessed her during their first private meeting with the same detachment he used when evaluating horseflesh. Your family needs financial relief. I need a wife presentable enough to satisfy society. The arrangement benefits us both, he'd stated, as if negotiating a shipping contract. That first night after the wedding, he'd performed his duty with clinical precision, fulfilling what the marriage bed required before retreating to his own chambers. She'd remained awake until dawn, staring at the elaborate ceiling moldings, trying to convince herself the hollowness in her chest was simply fatigue. But it wasn't fatigue. It was the particular ache of being chosen for convenience, not love, wearing a wedding ring that felt more like a contract than a promise. By the 4th month, they'd established a rhythm as predictable as the London fog. Callum rose at dawn, reviewed shipping manifests over coffee he drank standing at the window, and disappeared into his study or the exchange. He addressed her only when household matters demanded it, brief exchanges that never approached intimacy. The solicitor requires your signature on the property documents. Very well. Lady Pemberton has invited us to her soirée. As you wish. But sometimes, only sometimes, she felt his gaze linger when she descended the stairs in her evening gown, or when she played piano in the music room thinking herself alone. He never acknowledged these moments, never allowed the glance to become a look. Iris filled her days with the tasks expected of a viscountess, managing the household accounts, overseeing staff, hosting the teas and dinners that maintained their social standing. She moved through the Merrick townhouse with practiced grace, occupying space without disrupting it, present without demanding presence. Her mother had warned her before the wedding, men of his station marry for dynasty, darling. Affection, if it comes at all, comes later. Be patient. Be perfect. Be indispensable. She hadn't realized how exhausting it would be to make herself indispensable to a man determined not to need her. On a crisp October evening, Iris stood in the portrait gallery, examining the faces of Merrick women who'd come before her. Each painted viscountess stared back with the same expression, composed, elegant, alone. She held the household ledger against her chest, freshly balanced, every penny accounted for. Callum appeared at the gallery entrance without warning, still wearing his coat from the exchange, smelling faintly of tobacco and autumn wind. He paused when he saw her, not because he wanted conversation, but because she occupied the path to his study. Lady Merrick. His voice carried its usual measured distance, as formal as if addressing a stranger. The accounts are ready for your review, she replied, extending the ledger. They're in the study. I'll examine them after supper. She nodded, moving aside to let him pass. But as he walked by, something made him pause. Perhaps it was the way candlelight caught the exhaustion she couldn't quite hide around her eyes. Perhaps it was the realization that she'd been standing alone in a gallery of forgotten wives. He glanced at her for one moment longer than propriety required, as if seeing something he hadn't bothered to notice before. "You've reorganized the shipping documentation system," he observed. She straightened slightly, surprised he'd noticed. It was inefficient. "The new system saves time." The faintest shift passed through his expression, something that might have been approval in a man who allowed himself such sentiments. "Efficient," he said carefully. "That's unexpected." "Is it?" she asked quietly. "You chose me for practicality, Lord Merrick." "I'm simply fulfilling my purpose." He had no response to that. He inclined his head once, curt and formal, then continued toward his study, bootfalls echoing down the marble corridor. Iris released a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. That was the first fracture in the wall between them. Not affection, not attraction, not even kindness, just the smallest acknowledgement that she possessed competence beyond what he'd calculated. But later that night, standing outside the drawing room where the servants thought her out of earshot, she overheard two footmen speaking in low voices. "Lord Merrick's still looking, isn't he? They say he wants a match with the Lennox family. Real power, real connections. What about Lady Merrick? Placeholder, everyone knows it. He'll set her aside the moment Parliament allows a quiet divorce. She was only ever temporary." Iris didn't move, didn't react, didn't let her face betray the way those words carved into her. She'd known this truth since before the wedding, had accepted it as the price of saving her family from financial ruin. But knowing and hearing are different kinds of pain. Knowing is a wound you can manage. Hearing is a blade that turns. She walked to her chambers with measured steps, the way women walk when their hearts are breaking and the world must never see. In the privacy of her room, she sat at her vanity, fingers trembling as they touched the pearl necklace he'd given her on their wedding day. A gift chosen by his secretary, she suspected. Pretty, appropriate, meaningless. She whispered to her own reflection, voice steady despite everything. "I am temporary." The truth settled over her like the fog outside, cold and suffocating and impossible to escape. Yet the next morning, when Callum passed her in the hallway, he paused longer than necessary. Long enough to notice the new tension in her shoulders. Long enough to feel something uncomfortable shift in his chest when she met his gaze with eyes that held none of their usual quiet warmth, only careful distance. He nodded. She nodded back. A hollow marriage. A convenient wife. A man who believed he'd chosen someone easily replaced. Neither understood that this was the first crack in the life they'd both accepted. The kind of crack that would soon split everything wide open. Callum descended the stairs at precisely 7 o'clock, as he had every morning for the past 4 months. The dining room awaited him with its usual formality, silver gleaming under gaslight, coffee steaming in the pot, newspapers folded at his place. But Iris's chair sat empty. He paused in the doorway, hand tightening on the frame. She was always there. Not speaking much, certainly not expecting conversation, but present. A quiet fixture of his mornings, like the grandfather clock in the hall or the portrait of his grandfather glowering from the wall. The young maid, Sarah, appeared with fresh toast, her eyes lowered. "Where is Lady Merrick?" The question came out sharper than he intended. "In her chambers, my lord." Sarah set the toast down with trembling fingers. "She asked for her meal to be brought upstairs. Said she prefers it that way now." Now. As if this were a new arrangement. As if she'd decided something without consulting him. Callum sat, unfolding his napkin with deliberate precision. "I see." But he didn't see. He stared at the empty chair across from him, at the untouched place setting, and felt something unfamiliar coil in his chest. Not anger, exactly. Something closer to displacement, as if the furniture had been rearranged in the night and now nothing fit properly. He forced himself to eat, to read the Morning Post, to review the shipping reports. But his gaze kept drifting to that chair, and the coffee grew cold in his cup. By mid-morning, he found himself wandering. Not intentionally, not with any purpose, but his study felt suffocating and the exchange could wait. His footsteps carried him through the townhouse, past the library where she sometimes read, past the morning room where she wrote correspondence. Both empty. Then he heard it. Music, faint and melancholy, drifting from the west wing. Callum followed the sound to a room he rarely entered, the music room his mother had insisted upon decades ago, now largely forgotten. The door stood ajar, and through the gap he saw her. Iris sat at the piano, fingers moving across the keys with a grace that arrested him completely. The piece was mournful, something in a minor key that seemed to pull sorrow from the air itself. Her eyes were closed, her body swaying slightly, and for the first time since their wedding, he saw her unguarded. Lost in something that had nothing to do with household accounts or social obligations or being the perfect, invisible wife. She looked beautiful. And utterly, devastatingly sad. He must have made a sound, a breath, a shifted weight, because her eyes opened and her hands stilled mid-phrase. The silence crashed down between them. Lord Merrick. She stood quickly, smoothing her skirts. I didn't realize you were home. I didn't know you played. The words felt inadequate the moment they left his mouth. Something flickered across her face. No. You wouldn't. You play beautifully. Thank you. Polite. Distant. The same tone she used with tradesmen. He stepped into the room, suddenly desperate to keep her there, to understand the woman who'd been living in his house like a ghost. You weren't at breakfast. No. Are you unwell? I'm perfectly well, my lord. The formality stung. Then why? I wasn't needed there. She moved toward the door, toward escape. If you'll excuse me, I have. Iris. She stopped, but didn't turn. Her name in his mouth felt strange, foreign. He couldn't remember the last time he'd said it. Yes, my lord. A dozen questions crowded his throat. When did you learn to play? What was that piece? Why have you never played for me? Why are you pulling away? But what emerged was, nothing. Forgive me for disturbing you. She nodded once and left, her footsteps fading down the corridor with that particular grace she had, the kind that made it seem like she was barely there at all. Callum stood alone in the music room, staring at the piano bench she'd vacated, at the sheet music she'd left behind. He couldn't read music, but he could see the title, Nocturne in E-flat minor. Something about longing, he imagined. Something about loss. You never asked. The words haunted him back to his study. He sat at his desk, pulled the shipping manifests toward him, and stared at the columns of numbers without seeing them. When had he asked her anything that mattered? What was her favorite book? Did she prefer tea or coffee? What did she dream about when she lay awake in the bed he rarely shared? He knew the answer. Never. He'd never asked. She was his wife in name, a signature on documents, a woman who managed his household with quiet efficiency and demanded nothing in return. He'd thought that was what he wanted. Simplicity. Practicality. A marriage stripped of messy emotion and inconvenient expectations. But now the silence in his study felt oppressive. He found himself listening for her footsteps in the hall, for the whisper of her skirts, for some evidence that she still moved through his world. The sounds never came. Evening fell, and the gas lamps were lit, and still he sat with unfinished work before him. The house pressed down around him, all its elegant rooms and expensive furnishings suddenly hollow. Empty in a way they'd never been before. The townhouse had always been quiet. Tonight, it felt abandoned. The library door was open, afternoon light spilling across Persian rugs and leather-bound volumes. Callum had come for the shipping ledger, nothing more, but he stopped when he saw her. Iris sat in the window seat, a book open in her lap, completely absorbed. Not the household management texts she usually consulted, not the etiquette guides or recipe collections. Something slim, worn at the edges, held with a tenderness he'd never seen her direct at anything in his house. She didn't notice him at first. The light caught her profile, the elegant line of her neck, the slight furrow between her brows as she read. She looked younger somehow, or perhaps just unguarded, the careful composure she wore like armor temporarily set aside. Then her gaze lifted and found him. The book snapped shut. She stood, smoothing her skirts, and the woman who'd been lost in reading vanished behind the Viscountess who remembered her place. "Lord Merrick. I didn't hear you come in. Don't let me disturb you." But his eyes had already caught the spine as she moved to hide it. Gold lettering, faded but legible, Keats. "You enjoy poetry?" A pause, brief but weighted. "I used to." "Used to?" He stepped closer, genuinely curious. "What changed?" "I did." She held the book against her chest like a shield. "Or rather, my circumstances did." "I don't follow." "No." Something flickered in her eyes, not quite bitterness, but close. "I suppose you wouldn't." "Iris." "Before, Lord Merrick. I enjoyed poetry before." "Before what?" She looked at him directly then, and he felt the words before she spoke them, felt them land like stones in water. "Before practicality became everything." The silence stretched. He should say something, explain that practicality wasn't coldness, that security wasn't indifference. But she was already moving past him, the book of poetry still clutched to her chest, and he let her go because he didn't know how to ask her to stay. The ledger sat forgotten on the desk. He stood in the empty library, surrounded by thousands of words he'd never read, and wondered when exactly his wife had stopped reading poetry. The next evening, he asked her to join him for dinner. Not ordered, not assumed, asked. And after a pause that felt eternal, she accepted. They sat at opposite ends of the table, an expanse of polished mahogany between them. The staff served in tense silence, eyes carefully averted from what was clearly their employer's first real meal together in days. Callum had prepared questions. Simple things, he'd told himself. Ways to know her better, to bridge whatever gap had opened between them. But every question felt like stepping onto ice that might crack. "The pheasant is excellent," he tried. "Yes, my lord. Cook has improved since you took over managing the kitchen." "I simply followed your mother's recipes." Silence. He took a drink of wine, gathering courage. "What else do you enjoy? Besides poetry, I mean." Iris's fork paused halfway to her lips. "My lord? I'm asking what you like. Your interests. I realize I don't know much about them." "There's no need for you to know." Polite. Empty. "Our arrangement doesn't require." "I want to know." She set down her fork carefully. "Why?" The question caught him off guard. "Why?" "Because you're my wife" seemed insufficient. "Because you're withdrawing and I don't understand why" felt too revealing. "Because you live in my house," he said finally. "Because we share a name." "Is that not reason enough?" "I play piano." "You discovered that yesterday." "I read poetry I no longer have time for." "I manage your household with efficiency you yourself noted." "What more would you like to catalogue, my lord?" The words were soft but they cut. Callum's wine glass trembled slightly in his hand. "Are you unwell?" "No, Lord Merrick. Simply tired." "Of what?" He leaned forward, desperate suddenly to understand. "Of what, Iris?" The pause stretched until he thought she wouldn't answer. The candles flickered. Somewhere in the kitchen, someone dropped a pan. Of pretending there's substance where there's only structure. His breath caught. She stood, napkin placed beside a barely touched plate, and curtsied with perfect grace. "If you'll excuse me, my lord. I find I'm not very hungry after all." She left. He sat alone at the long table, surrounded by fine china and crystal, and his hand shook so badly he had to set down his glass before the wine spilled. The third day, Callum locked himself in his study. Work should have steadied him. Numbers were reliable, shipping contracts straightforward, profit margins calculable. But he couldn't focus. His eyes kept drifting to the portrait above the mantel, his parents on their wedding day, young and formally posed. His father's hand on his mother's shoulder looked less like affection and more like ownership. His mother's smile never reached her eyes. They'd had a practical marriage. Successful by every measure that mattered to society. 2 sons, a fortune doubled, a reputation above reproach. They'd also spent 30 years in separate wings of the house, speaking only when necessary, dying within months of each other without ever having seemed truly alive. Callum had watched that marriage from childhood, had absorbed its lessons like gospel. Emotion was weakness, sentiment was foolishness, love was a luxury that men of station couldn't afford. He'd built his entire life on that foundation. Chosen carefully, married practically, maintained appropriate distance. Built a fortress that could withstand anything. Except loneliness. His fortress had no defense against that. Iris wasn't attacking his walls. She was simply walking away from them, quietly, gracefully, without drama or demands. And somehow that was worse than any siege. What have I done? The words escaped to the empty room. No answer came. Just the ticking of the clock, the distant sounds of a household running with the efficiency his wife maintained, and the crushing weight of understanding that came too late. He'd married her because she was practical. Because she wouldn't demand what he couldn't give. Because she'd accepted the terms without complaint or expectation. He'd never considered that acceptance and surrender looked identical from the outside, but felt entirely different within. She wasn't withdrawing out of spite. She was withdrawing out of survival. And he'd spent 4 months building walls between them. She'd simply walked away from the construction site. The Pemberton ballroom blazed with 1,000 candles, crystal chandeliers scattering light across London's finest. Callum stood near the refreshment table, champagne untouched in his hand, watching his wife move through the crowd like she'd been born to this. She wore emerald silk that made her skin luminous, her dark hair swept up to reveal the graceful column of her neck. Diamonds at her throat, his gift, chosen by his secretary, accepted without comment. She looked breathtaking. He wasn't the only man who'd noticed. "Lady Merrick, you must tell us about your charitable work," Lady Pemberton gushed, drawing Iris into a circle of society matrons. "We hear you've been quite instrumental in organizing the Winter Relief Fund." Iris smiled, warm and engaging, nothing like the careful distance she maintained at home. "The work is hardly mine alone. The committee has been wonderfully generous. Gracious. Deflecting. Perfect." Callum watched her navigate conversations with practiced ease, saw how she remembered names and inquired after children, how she made each person feel seen and valued. This was the Viscountess society expected, charming, capable, ornamental but useful. He'd thought he married a quiet mouse. He'd been catastrophically wrong. She was only quiet with him. Young Lord Pemberton approached her with a bow, hand extended. "Lady Merrick, might I request the next dance?" Iris glanced toward Callum, a brief flicker of something, permission seeking. Escape hoping, before accepting. "Of course, Lord Pemberton." Callum watched them take the floor. Pemberton was 23, heir to a shipping fortune that rivaled his own, handsome in that effortless way young men were before life hardened them. He held Iris properly, but his eyes lingered on her face, and when he said something that made her laugh, actually laugh, bright and genuine, Callum felt something savage tear through his chest. Jealousy. Raw and violent and entirely new. Other men saw what he dismissed. They saw grace and intelligence and beauty, while he'd filed her away as suitable and forgotten to look again. Pemberton's hand shifted slightly lower on her waist. Callum moved before thought, cutting through the crowd with single-minded purpose. He reached them mid-turn, tapped Pemberton's shoulder with more force than courtesy allowed. Cutting in. Pemberton blinked, startled. Lord Merrick, the dance isn't. Now. Something in Callum's voice made the younger man step back. Iris's eyes widened, but she said nothing as Callum's hand replaced Pemberton's at her waist, his other hand capturing hers. Her fingers were cold. He wanted to warm them. The orchestra swelled into a waltz, and they moved together for the first time in weeks. This close, he could smell her perfume, rose water and vanilla, familiar and devastating. Could feel the warmth of her through layers of silk and propriety. Could see the slight pulse at her throat, rapid and betraying. "You look beautiful tonight." The words came out rougher than intended. "Thank you." Polite. A response she'd give any compliment from any stranger. They turned, his hand firm at her waist, her gaze fixed somewhere over his shoulder. "Why do you smile at everyone but me?" Her eyes finally met his. "You've never wanted my smiles, Lord Merrick." "Callum." His grip tightened slightly. "My name is Callum." "Is it?" Soft, but with edges. "Am I permitted to use it?" The question landed like an accusation because it was one. How many months had she called him, my lord, and Lord Merrick, while he'd barely said her name at all? "Yes." His voice dropped. "I want you to use it." The music swelled around them, violins aching with something that felt like longing. He pulled her closer, imperceptibly, barely an inch, but enough that he felt her breath catch. She stiffened, and he braced for her to pull away. But then, slowly, she softened. Just slightly. Just enough that the space between them felt less like a chasm and more like a held breath. They moved together, and for a moment, one fragile, suspended moment, it felt like dancing with his wife instead of performing with a stranger. Then the music ended. She stepped back immediately, curtsying with perfect form. "Thank you, my lord." Back to formality. Back to distance. She walked away before he could respond, emerald silk disappearing into the crowd, and he stood alone on the dance floor while couples reformed around him like water flowing past a stone. The carriage ride home began in silence. Storm clouds had gathered during the ball, and now rain hammered against the roof in rhythm with something hammering in Callum's chest. Thunder rolled across London, making the horses nervous, making the darkness inside the carriage feel smaller, more intimate. Iris sat across from him, staring out the rain-streaked window as if the weather were fascinating. Lightning flashed, illuminating her profile for a heartbeat before plunging them back into shadow. Callum searched for words and found only inadequate ones. "You danced well tonight." "I was taught to." The response was automatic, empty. He pushed forward anyway. "By whom?" A pause. More thunder. "My mother." "She taught you to waltz." "She taught me everything." Iris's voice was steady, but something beneath it trembled. How to move through a ballroom. How to make conversation without saying anything of substance. How to smile until my face ached. How to be valuable when you have nothing of value to offer. Lightning again. Her face appeared ghostly in the flash, beautiful and haunted. She said a woman's grace is her greatest currency when she has nothing else to trade. The words gutted him. Currency. Trade. She'd been taught to view herself as a transaction, and he'd done nothing to prove her mother wrong. He'd married her for her bloodline and her desperation, had taken what she offered and given nothing back, had treated her like a particularly useful piece of furniture. She'd traded herself to save her family. And he'd accepted the trade as if it meant nothing at all. "Iris. We're home." She gathered her skirts as the carriage stopped, not waiting for him to assist her. "Good night, my lord." She was gone before he could form a response, disappearing into the townhouse while rain soaked his shoulders. He stood in the downpour, watching the door she'd vanished through, and felt something crack inside him that he'd thought was solid stone. The storm broke over London that night, but the real tempest was just beginning inside Callum Merrick's chest. The Morning Post arrived during breakfast, Callum's solitary breakfast, as they'd become again. He sorted through correspondence with mechanical efficiency until he heard footsteps in the hall. Iris appeared in the doorway, a letter in her hands, and something about her expression made him look up. Her face had softened in a way he hadn't seen in weeks, a genuine smile touching her lips as she read. "Good news?" The question escaped before he could stop it. She glanced up, startled to find him watching. "My sister. Emma. She's invited me to visit her in Bath." "I see." He set down his coffee carefully. "For how long?" 2 weeks, perhaps 3. She refolded the letter with obvious pleasure. "She's just had her second child and wants 3 weeks." His stomach dropped, cold and sudden, like missing a step in the dark. Iris's smile faded slightly. "Unless you have objection." "I know it's rather sudden, but Emma says." "Of course not." He forced his voice to remain level, casual, as if her absence for 3 weeks didn't feel like the floor opening beneath him. "You're free to visit family. I wouldn't dream of preventing it." She studied his face for a moment, and he wondered what she saw there. Whatever it was, it made her nod slowly, expression settling back into that careful neutrality he'd come to hate. "Thank you, my lord. I'll begin preparations." She left before he could respond, and Callum sat alone with cooling coffee and the sudden, irrational urge to call her back. To say what? That the thought of 3 weeks without her made his chest tight. That he'd only just begun to notice her and now she was leaving. He said nothing. The silence swallowed his cowardice whole. Work proved impossible. Callum sat at his desk, staring at shipping manifests that might as well have been written in Sanskrit. 3 weeks. 21 days without her quiet presence, her careful efficiency, her absence that had somehow become more noticeable than her presence ever was. Why did that terrify him? He pushed away from the desk, restless, and found himself wandering the townhouse like a ghost in his own home. The music room first, where the piano sat silent, lid closed over keys she'd played with such melancholy grace. He touched the smooth wood, imagining her fingers there, the music she'd made when she thought no one was listening. The library next, where poetry still sat on the window seat. He picked up the Keats, opened it to a random page. Her handwriting in the margins, small, precise notes he couldn't decipher. Evidence of an inner life he'd never bothered to explore. The dining room, with its long table and empty chairs. How many mornings had he eaten alone now? How many evenings? When had her absence at meals stopped being convenient and started feeling like abandonment? Finally, he climbed the stairs to the family wing, past his own chambers to hers. The door stood ajar. He shouldn't enter, it was her private space, the one room in this house that was truly hers, but his feet carried him forward anyway. Rose water and vanilla hit him immediately, subtle but unmistakable. Her scent, woven into the very air. He closed his eyes and breathed it in, wondering how he'd never noticed before that she smelled like comfort, like something soft in a world of sharp edges. The room was neat, everything in its place. Hairbrush on the vanity. Book on the nightstand. A piece of embroidery draped over the chair by the window, half finished, the needle still threaded with deep blue silk. Callum sat in her chair, lifted the embroidery with careful hands. The work was exquisite, tiny stitches forming a pattern of winter roses. Patient work. Delicate work. The kind of thing that took hours of quiet dedication. How many evenings had she sat here, creating beauty while he sat in his study with his ledgers? How many moments had accumulated, unnoticed, into this marriage he'd treated as a transaction? Marriage wasn't a contract. It was this, embroidery and morning coffee and the way someone sent lingered in a room. It was piano music and poetry and the small ways a person made a space their own. It was presence, daily and unremarkable, until suddenly it was gone and the absence carved a hole you hadn't known you'd needed filled. He'd ignored every moment. Dismissed every offering. And now she was leaving, and he had no right to ask her to stay because he'd made her optional in his own life. Evening found him at her door again, knocking softly. The sound felt foreign. He'd never knocked before, had simply assumed access to every part of his house, every part of his wife. Iris opened the door, surprise flickering across her features. A trunk sat open on her bed, half-packed. Lord Merrick. Is something wrong? Everything was wrong. May I speak with you? Of course, my lord. She stepped back, allowing him entry, and he hated the formality, hated that they'd regressed to strangers who used titles like shields. About your trip. He stopped, unsure how to continue. What could he say? Don't go. I'll miss you. I'm only just realizing I married someone worth keeping. Yes. Her voice was guarded, careful. Do you wish to go? She blinked. Does it matter what I wish? It matters to me. The words hung between them. Iris stared at him, and for a moment he thought she might say something real, something that would crack open this awful distance. But then her expression smoothed, became polite and impenetrable. Does it? She turned back to her packing. I'll return in 3 weeks, Lord Merrick. The household will manage without me. It always has. The words were a knife between his ribs, sharp and precise and devastatingly true. She'd been managing everything, the staff, the accounts, the social obligations, while being treated as if she were expendable. Optional. Replaceable. He'd made her optional in his own life. Iris. Was there anything else, my lord? The dismissal was gentle but absolute. He had no words that could bridge this chasm, no way to articulate the panic rising in his throat at the thought of her leaving. No. Nothing else. He left her to her packing, retreating to his study where he couldn't think, couldn't work, couldn't do anything but count the hours. She would leave in 2 days. He had 48 hours to figure out what he couldn't say in 4 months. November arrived with bitter cold and grey skies that matched the weight in Callum's chest. He descended the stairs at dawn to find the household already assembled in the entrance hall, maids, footmen, cook, even old Martin who rarely left the upper floors. All of them waiting to say goodbye to a woman who'd lived among them for only 4 months. Iris stood at the center, dressed in a simple traveling gown of deep blue wool. Not one of the expensive dresses he'd ordered from the modiste, but something older, perhaps borrowed from her sister. It made her look younger somehow, more vulnerable, less like the polished viscountess and more like the woman she'd been before practicality had stripped away softness. Mrs. Hartley, the housekeeper, embraced her openly. You take care, my lady. Come back to us soon. I will. Thank you for everything. Iris's voice was thick with genuine emotion. The footmen bowed with a respect that went beyond duty. Sarah, the young maid, had tears in her eyes. Even cook had emerged from the kitchen, flour still on her apron, to press a packet of traveling biscuits into Iris's hands. They loved her. The realization hit Callum with uncomfortable force. In 4 months, his wife had earned the devotion of every person in his household through simple kindness. And in 29 years, he'd earned nothing but fearful efficiency. The carriage waited in the frost-sharp morning, horses stamping impatiently. A footman reached for Iris's bag, but Callum stepped forward first. I'll take it. Silence rippled through the assembly. The staff stared as their employer, a viscount who'd never performed manual labor in his life, carried his wife's modest traveling case to the carriage himself. It wasn't heavy. It should have been heavier, fuller, but she was only taking what she needed, leaving most of herself behind. He placed it inside, then turned to offer his hand. She took it, and the brief contact felt like touching something breakable, something he'd already cracked without meaning to. At the carriage door, she paused. Safe travels, Lady Merrick. Thank you. Her voice was steady, but her eyes held something that might have been sadness. Or resignation. Or both. She started to climb inside, then stopped. Turned back. Callum. His heart stopped. His name. She'd said his name, not his title, and it sounded like forgiveness or goodbye or perhaps both at once. Yes. Take care of yourself. She meant it. He could hear it in her voice, see it in the concern that flickered across her features. Even now, even after everything he'd failed to give her, she worried about him. I will, he managed, though the words felt like stones in his throat. She nodded once, climbed into the carriage, and the door closed between them. He stood in the cold as the horses pulled away, watching until the carriage became a dot on the horizon, then nothing at all. The staff dispersed silently, returning to their duties. Callum remained in the street, frost settling on his coat, until Martin touched his elbow gently. Come inside, my lord. You'll catch your death. He went inside. But death already lived in the hollow spaces of his house. The day stretched like an open wound. Callum tried to work, spreading shipping contracts across his desk, but the numbers blurred meaningless. He couldn't eat the breakfast laid before him, couldn't summon interest in correspondence that demanded answers. The study felt suffocating, walls pressing close, so he abandoned it for the music room. The piano sat silent, a rebuke in polished wood. He touched the keys experimentally, discordant notes that jangled in the empty air, nothing like the melancholy beauty she'd coaxed from the instrument. He'd never asked her to play for him. Never asked for anything except efficiency and invisibility. The library drew him next. Her book of Keats still rested on the window seat, and he picked it up with careful hands, as if it might disintegrate under rough touch. Opening to a random page, he found verses underlined in pencil, her handwriting delicate in the margins. I have been half in love with easeful death. The line was marked with a small asterisk. Beside it, in her careful script, not death. Just silence. Blessed silence from wanting. His throat tightened. Was this about him? About their marriage? About the slow suffocation of living with someone who treated love like a transaction? Dinner arrived untouched. The staff exchanged worried glances. Lord Merrick never refused food, but he couldn't force down more than a few bites. Everything tasted like ash. Night fell. He found himself walking past her chambers, saw the door standing ajar. He should respect her privacy, should leave her space inviolate. Instead, he stepped inside. Rose water and vanilla enveloped him immediately, her scent woven into fabric and air and memory. Everything was neat, orderly, she'd left her room the way she lived her life, causing no trouble, demanding no attention. But personal items remained. Her hairbrush on the vanity, strands of dark hair still caught in the bristles. A book on the nightstand. And on her writing desk, a half-written letter. He shouldn't read it. Knew it was wrong even as his hand reached for the paper, even as his eyes found her familiar script. Dearest Emma. I know you worry about my marriage. Please don't. Lord Merrick is not unkind, merely practical. I've learned not to expect warmth where there was never meant to be any. In truth, I think I'm learning to accept that some people are meant to be loved, and others are meant to be useful. I've made my peace with which I am. The letter ended there, unfinished. Perhaps she'd been interrupted. Perhaps she couldn't bring herself to complete the thought. Callum sat on the edge of her bed, letter trembling in his hands. She thought she was only useful. Not loved, not valued, not cherished, just useful. Like a particularly efficient piece of machinery. Like something to be maintained but never treasured. He'd made her believe that. Through his distance, his formality, his careful preservation of walls that were supposed to protect him but had only imprisoned them both. He'd taken a woman who read poetry and played piano with her whole heart, and he'd convinced her she was nothing more than a function to perform. He'd destroyed something precious through sheer neglect. His head dropped into his hands. And for the first time since he was a child weeping over his mother's coldness, Callum Merrick cried. Not dramatically, not with great heaving sobs, quietly, like everything she did. Tears slipped between his fingers while her scent surrounded him and her words echoed in his skull. Some people are meant to be loved, and others are meant to be useful. She'd placed herself in the second category. And he'd done nothing to prove her wrong. He sat in her empty room as night deepened around him, holding a letter that broke him, breathing air that still held traces of a woman who'd been kind enough to marry him and foolish enough to hope he might notice. He'd lost her before he ever knew he had her. And now he had 3 weeks to figure out if he could earn what he'd once been given freely. The second day without her, Callum forced himself to the exchange. Work had always been his refuge, numbers and contracts a language he understood better than emotion. But sitting across from Whitfield and Sons, reviewing shipping terms for the India route, he found himself reading the same clause 3 times without comprehension. Lord Merrick. Whitfield's voice cut through the fog. The tariff percentage? Callum blinked at the document. Yes. 12%. 15, my lord. As we discussed last week. Heat crept up his neck. He never made errors like this, never let personal matters interfere with business. Of course. 15. My apologies. Whitfield exchanged glances with his son. They noticed. Of course they noticed. Callum Merrick, always precise, always controlled, suddenly fumbling basic arithmetic like a distracted clerk. He signed the documents with shaking hands, knowing he'd nearly cost his company thousands through sheer inattention. All because he couldn't stop thinking about an empty chair at breakfast, a silent music room, the way her handwriting looked in the margins of poetry books. The third day, he accepted Lady Pembroke's dinner invitation. Anything to escape the tomb his townhouse had become. But sitting among London's elite, surrounded by crystal and candlelight and empty conversation, proved worse than solitude. And Lady Merrick's organization of the Winter Relief Fund was simply masterful, Lady Pembroke was saying. Such a gracious Viscountess you found, Lord Merrick. We're all quite envious. Callum's wine glass trembled in his grip. Gracious. Yes. Iris was gracious, and kind, and infinitely patient with a husband who'd noticed none of it until she was gone. She's visiting family, he heard himself say. How lovely. You must miss her terribly. The glass nearly shattered in his hand. He set it down carefully, pushed back from the table. Forgive me. I'm not feeling well. Please excuse my early departure. Rude. Unforgivably rude. But necessary, because the walls were closing in and he couldn't breathe and everyone kept talking about his wife as if they knew her better than he did. They probably did. He arrived home disheveled, cravat askew, hair disordered from dragging his fingers through it during the carriage ride. Martin met him in his chambers, helping him out of his coat with the practiced silence of 30 years' service. Will Lady Merrick return soon, my lord? Callum's shoulders sagged. 3 weeks. Ah. Martin folded the coat with meticulous care. The house misses her. The house? The words came out sharper than intended. Martin didn't flinch. Forgive me, my lord, but yes. The house. And if I may speak plainly. When have I ever stopped you? Callum sat heavily on the bed, too tired to maintain pretense. You seem diminished without her, sir. Diminished? A bitter laugh escaped. That's one word for it. Bless yourself, Martin continued gently. As if a piece of you left with her carriage. Callum stared at his hands, hands that had signed contracts worth thousands, that had built an empire, that had never once reached for his wife with anything resembling tenderness. What if I was never myself, Martin? What if I've been playing a part my whole life? The cold Merrick air, practical and unfeeling, exactly like my father before me. Martin hung the coat in the wardrobe, his movements careful. Then perhaps Lady Merrick is the first person who made you want to stop performing. The word settled into Callum's chest, heavy and true. He'd spent 29 years being what was expected, the dutiful son, the shrewd businessman, the emotionally contained aristocrat. And then Iris had entered his life, asking nothing, demanding nothing, simply existing with a quiet grace that made all his armor feel like a cage. "She loves you, you know." Callum's head snapped up. "What?" Martin's expression was kind, almost pitying. "The staff see things, my lord. We're furniture to you, perhaps, but we have eyes. The way she looks at you when you're not watching. The way her face falls when you leave a room without acknowledging her. She's tried not to love you, I think. But the heart doesn't always obey practicality. I've given her nothing to love." Callum's voice cracked on the last word. "Nothing but coldness and distance and a marriage that's a transaction in everything but name. Perhaps that's why it matters so much." Martin moved toward the door, pausing at the threshold. "When someone loves you despite receiving nothing in return, that's not obligation, my lord. That's choice. The rarest kind." He left Callum alone with that truth, with the weight of love given freely to a man who'd never thought to earn it. The room felt too large, too empty. Callum rose on unsteady legs and found himself walking to her chambers again, drawn by something beyond reason. He sat at her vanity, surrounded by the small personal items she'd left behind. Hairpins. A book of pressed flowers. And there, a crystal perfume bottle, simple and elegant, like everything about her. He picked it up with shaking hands. Removed the stopper. Rose water and vanilla flooded his senses, so powerfully present it was like she stood beside him. He inhaled deeply, desperately, trying to hold on to something he'd never properly held in the first place. Once. Twice. 3 times, each breath a drowning, each breath a resurrection. He clutched the bottle against his chest like a lifeline, like the most precious thing he'd ever touched, because it held her essence, her softness, everything he'd dismissed as insignificant. "I need you." The words escaped to the empty room, raw and broken. "God help me, I need you." He inhaled again, tears streaming down his face, all his careful control shattered against the rocks of her absence. "I miss you." Louder now, as if she might hear him across the miles. "I miss everything I never noticed. Your footsteps. Your silence. The way you exist in this house like light, like breath, like something essential I took for granted." One more breath of her perfume, one more desperate attempt to fill the hollowness. "Come home." A plea. A prayer. "Please come home." And in that moment, with her scent surrounding him and his walls finally, irrevocably crumbled, Callum understood. This wasn't loneliness. This wasn't simply missing efficient household management or polite dinner company. This was love. He was in love with his wife. Had been falling for weeks, maybe months, maybe from the very beginning when she'd stood in his study with quiet dignity and agreed to marry a man who'd offered her nothing but security. He'd been too armored to see it, too convinced that men like him didn't get softness, didn't deserve warmth, didn't need anything beyond contracts and duty. But he needed her. Needed her poetry and her piano playing and the way she moved through rooms like a whisper. Needed her kindness and her patience and her foolish, unearned love. He'd spent 29 years building walls. She'd walked through them without even trying. And now he'd do anything, to bring her home. Callum woke before dawn with perfect clarity. No more questioning, no more rationalizing, no more careful weighing of consequences. He simply knew, the way a man knows which direction is home even in complete darkness. He rang for Martin before he was fully dressed. The valet appeared within minutes, impeccable despite the early hour. "My lord. Prepare the carriage." "For the exchange, sir." "For Bath." Martin's face remained professionally neutral, but something shifted in his eyes, approval, perhaps, or relief. "Very good, my lord." Callum fastened his cuffs, hands steady for the first time in days. "And Martin?" "Yes, sir." Thank you. Martin allowed himself the smallest smile. She's worth it, my lord. I know. The carriage departed within the hour, wheels clattering over London streets still empty of traffic. Callum sat inside, watching the city give way to countryside without truly seeing any of it. His mind worked furiously, rehearsing words that never sounded right. I've been a fool, too simple, too easy. Foolishness implied mistake, not cruelty. Not the systematic dismantling of a woman's hope through indifference. I love you, too abrupt. You couldn't starve someone for months and then offer them a feast and expect gratitude. Please come home, too demanding. She deserved choice, agency, the freedom to refuse him the way he'd refused her every gesture of warmth. No perfect words existed. Only truth. Messy, vulnerable, terrifying truth, offered without armor or expectation. The carriage stopped at an inn halfway, horses needing rest even if Callum didn't. The innkeeper appeared with ale and bread, weathered face kind beneath grey hair. Travelling far, sir? To Bath. Callum barely touched the ale. To retrieve my wife. Ah, she visiting family? Her sister. New baby. Must miss her something fierce to travel in this cold. The innkeeper refilled his tankard. Wife's been gone 3 days, and already I'm eating burnt toast and sleeping poorly. Callum's throat tightened. More than I knew possible. The words hung in the air, spoken to a stranger, but feeling like confession. Like practice for the harder truth ahead. Then you're doing the right thing, traveling to her. The innkeeper nodded sagely. A man who knows what he's lost, that's a man with a chance at keeping it. Callum left coins that were far too generous and returned to the carriage. Afternoon light was fading, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. Bath appeared on the horizon, stone buildings glowing in the dying sun, and his pulse kicked into something between anticipation and terror. The address Emma had written in her invitation led to a modest townhouse on a respectable street. Not wealthy, but well-kept, with window boxes awaiting spring flowers. Callum stood before the door, straightening his coat with hands that actually trembled. He knocked. A young maid answered, eyes widening in recognition. Lord Merrick. A woman's voice from inside, warm and curious. Who is it, Mary? Then Iris's sister appeared, Emma Dalton, maiden name, not yet married. She looked like Iris but softer, rounder, with the contentment of someone who'd never learned to make herself smaller. Her eyes assessed him with immediate suspicion. Lord Merrick. We weren't expecting you. Is she here? The words came out rougher than intended. Emma's expression cooled several degrees. Iris is resting. She's been tired. The pause before tired held volumes. Emotionally exhausted. Heartsick. Worn thin by a marriage that demanded everything and offered nothing. May I see her? Why? Direct challenge, no deference to his title. She was protecting her sister the way he should have been protecting his wife. Callum met her gaze. Because I've made terrible mistakes. Because she deserves better. Because his voice cracked, splintering on the truth. Because I need to tell her something I should have said months ago. Emma studied him, seeing past the expensive coat and aristocratic bearing to something raw and desperate underneath. Whatever she found there made her step aside. She's in the garden. Callum walked through the narrow hallway, heart hammering against his ribs, toward the woman he'd married but never truly claimed, until now. The garden was small, winter bare, all dormant earth and skeletal trees waiting for spring that seemed impossibly far away. Frost clung to the ground in patches where sunlight hadn't reached, and the flower beds held only the brown remnants of last season's blooms. Iris sat on a wooden bench, wrapped in a wool shawl the color of rust, staring at nothing. Or perhaps staring at everything, at the death that preceded rebirth, at the quiet that came before growth. She looked peaceful in a way that made Callum's chest ache, but also sad, as if peace and sadness had become indistinguishable in her world. He stood in the doorway, drinking in the sight of her. 6 days. Only 6 days since she'd left, but it felt like months, like years, like he'd been walking through fog and had only just now remembered what clarity looked like. She hadn't seen him yet. He could turn around, retreat, let her have these 3 weeks of peace away from a husband who'd given her nothing but emptiness. But his feet carried him forward, boots crunching on frost-stiff grass. A branch cracked under his weight. She turned, and froze. Callum. His name. Not his title, not the formal address she'd used like armor, but his name, and it sounded like surprise and hope and fear all tangled together. Hello, Iris. She stood slowly, shawl clutched tight around her shoulders. What are you doing here? I came for you. Her expression shuddered, defenses rising like walls. I said 3 weeks. I know. It's been 6 days. I know that too. Silence stretched between them, filled only with wind stirring bare branches and the distant call of winter birds. She pulled her shawl tighter, the gesture achingly defensive, and he hated that she felt the need to protect herself from him. Is something wrong at home? Her voice carried the careful neutrality of someone expecting bad news. The accounts, or the staff, or... Everything is wrong at home. She looked up sharply, concern flickering across her features. Still worried about him, about his house, about the practical matters even now. You're not there. The words landed soft but absolute. She stared at him, lips parting slightly, breath visible in the cold air. Callum, I don't understand. He stepped closer, slowly, like approaching something wild that might bolt. I know you don't. I've made sure you wouldn't. What do you mean? I mean I've been a coward. The words tasted like truth in ash. I married you for practical reasons and convinced myself that was enough. That practicality was safer than feeling. That distance was protection from everything my parents' marriage taught me to fear. You don't need to. Yes, I do. He closed more distance, desperate now. Please. Let me say this. She nodded, silent, and he saw her hands trembling where they gripped her shawl. When you left, I thought I'd simply miss having efficient household management. That the house would feel different because you weren't balancing ledgers or managing staff. He swallowed hard. But the first morning, I couldn't eat breakfast because you weren't there. Not because the food was wrong, but because your chair was empty and I'd never realized how much space you occupied until it was hollow. The second day, I heard piano music that wasn't playing. Phantom melodies haunting rooms you'd once filled with beauty I'd been too deaf to hear. Tears gathered in her eyes, catching light like crystal. The third day, I found the poetry you'd been reading. Keats. You'd underlined verses about longing, about wanting, and I realized I know nothing about you, nothing that matters. What makes you laugh? What makes you sad? What do you dream about when you're alone? Callum. And then I found your letter. The one to Emma. She went rigid. You read my private correspondence. I know. I'm sorry. It was unconscionable, but Iris. His voice cracked. You wrote that you're meant to be useful, not loved. That you've made peace with which you are. Tears slipped down her cheeks now, twin tracks of silver in the fading light. You're wrong. He closed the final distance between them, near enough to see the gold flecks in her eyes, near enough to feel her breath. You're so wrong. Don't. The word broke on a sob. Don't say things you don't mean just because. You think you're temporary. His hands lifted, hovering near her face, asking permission. You're the only permanent thing in my life. The only thing that matters. You think you're just useful. You're essential. Like breath. Like light. Like everything I didn't know I needed until I was suffocating in your absence. His fingers finally touched her face, cupping her jaw with a tenderness that felt like breaking and healing simultaneously. You think you're not meant to be loved? His voice shattered completely. I love you. I've been falling in love with you for weeks, maybe months, maybe from the moment you stood in my study and agreed to marry a man too broken to see what he was being given. I was too afraid to see it. Too convinced that men like me don't get softness, don't deserve warmth. That love was weakness my father would have despised. She was crying openly now, but she didn't pull away. But you, he couldn't continue for a moment, couldn't speak past the emotion crushing his chest. You made me want to be someone who deserves you. Someone brave enough to feel. Someone worthy of your poetry and your music and your foolish, unearned kindness. Callum. His name was a prayer, a question, a benediction. Come home. Not because you have to. Not because it's duty or obligation or the terms of a contract you signed to save your family. His thumbs brushed away her tears, the gesture achingly gentle. Come home because you want to. Because I'm asking, not demanding. Because I need you, Iris. Not as a wife in name. Not as someone to manage my household or smile at society. As my wife. My partner. The woman I love more than I thought I could love anything. The silence that followed felt eternal. She stood within his hands, face wet, searching his eyes for truth or lies or some evidence that this wasn't another dream that would dissolve in morning light. You love me? Whispered, disbelieving. Desperately. But you said, the marriage was practical. I was a fool. He pressed his forehead to hers, breathing her in, rose water and vanilla and something essentially Iris beneath it all. The marriage was practical. What I feel for you is anything but. Her hand came to his chest, over his heart, and he knew she could feel it racing, could feel the truth of every word pounding beneath her palm. Come home with me. Please. She looked up at him, face tilted, tears still falling. What about the Lennox family? What about them? The servants said you wanted that alliance. That I was just. I don't care about alliances. The words were fierce. I care about you. Only you. And when your family expects. Let them expect. He cupped her face in both hands now, holding her like she was the most precious thing he'd ever touched. You're my family now. If you'll have me. She searched his face, looking for cracks in the facade, for the cold distance she'd learned to expect. But he held nothing back now, let her see everything, the fear and desperation and love that had broken him open and remade him into someone new. Something in her expression shifted. Softened. I loved you from the beginning, you know. Her voice was small but steady. Even when you didn't see me. Even when I was just convenient, just useful, just temporary. I couldn't help it. His breath caught, trapped somewhere between his throat and his breaking heart. I'm sorry. The apology felt inadequate, too small for the enormity of what he'd done. I'm sorry I made you wait so long to hear me say it back. Say it again. He cupped her face, tilted it up to his, let her see every ounce of truth in his eyes. I love you, Iris Merrick. And I will spend the rest of my life proving it. Every day. Every moment. Until you believe it as deeply as I feel it. She rose on her toes, closing the distance between them until her lips nearly touched his. Then take me home. She said yes. Not to duty, not to practicality, not to obligation. She said yes to love. The carriage ride home felt like entering a different world. Not sitting at opposite ends of the bench with an ocean of mahogany and unspoken words between them, but side by side, Callum's arm wrapped around Iris's shoulders, her head resting against his chest where she could hear his heartbeat, steady, real, hers. The silence was comfortable this time. Not the brittle quiet of two strangers trapped in proximity, but the peaceful hush of two people who'd finally stopped running from each other. When did you know? Iris's voice was soft, almost dreamy. That I loved you. Callum was quiet for a moment, his fingers tracing absent patterns on her shoulder. I think I've known for a while. But I admitted it when I found your perfume bottle. She lifted her head, eyebrows raised. My perfume? He had the grace to look embarrassed. I may have spent some time in your chambers while you were gone. Lord Merrick. Her tone was teasing, lighter than he'd ever heard it. That's very improper. I was desperate. He pulled her closer, voice dropping. I missed you so much I couldn't think, couldn't work, couldn't function. I stood in your room and inhaled your perfume like a madman, trying to remember what it felt like when you were still there. She laughed softly, the sound warming something deep in his chest. That's incredibly romantic. Is it? I thought it was pathetic. No. She settled back against him. It's perfect. They sat in comfortable silence as London's outskirts appeared through the window, gaslight beginning to flicker in the gathering dusk. Then. Callum. Yes. Kiss me. He did. Slow and tender and full of promises he intended to keep, everything their wedding kiss had failed to be. When they finally parted, foreheads pressed together, breath mingling in the small space between them. I love you, he whispered. I love you too. Simple words. World-changing words. The townhouse appeared as twilight deepened, and Callum felt Iris tense slightly beside him. This was the place of her loneliness, after all. The beautiful cage where she'd learned to make herself invisible. But the staff had assembled in the entrance hall, and when Callum helped her down from the carriage, refusing to let go of her hand, their faces showed nothing but genuine joy. Martin stepped forward, bowing with uncharacteristic warmth. Welcome home, Lady Merrick. Thank you, Martin. Iris's voice caught slightly. It's good to be home. She meant it this time. Callum heard the difference, felt it in the way her hand tightened around his. They crossed the threshold together, and the house did feel different. Not because anything had changed in the architecture or furnishings, but because they had changed, and that transformation had remade everything. Wait. Callum stopped just inside. What? I want to do this properly. Before she could protest, he scooped her into his arms. She gasped, laughing, as he carried her over the threshold while the staff tried and failed not to smile. Callum. We're already married. I know. He started up the stairs, cradling her against his chest. But I never carried you over the threshold the first time. I never did any of it properly, the courtship, the wedding night. So I'm starting over. He carried her to her chambers, their chambers now, and set her down gently, as if she were made of something precious and breakable. I'll leave you to rest, he said softly, though everything in him wanted to stay. Her hand caught his before he could step away. Or you could stay. Iris, I don't want you to feel obligated. I feel loved. Her eyes held his, clear and certain. For the first time in our marriage, I feel loved. Stay with me. He stayed. Morning light found them tangled together, and Callum woke first just to watch her sleep, the gentle rise and fall of her breath, the way her hair spread across his pillow, the peaceful expression on her face. When her eyes finally opened, he smiled. Good morning, wife. Good morning, husband. The same words, the same roles, but with completely different meaning now. They talked for hours. He asked about her childhood, her favorite music, her dreams. Why she'd underlined that particular verse in Keats. Everything he should have asked months ago but had been too armored to care about. She told him. About thunderstorms that made her feel alive. About oysters that made her ill. About her mother who'd died when she was 16, leaving behind a daughter who'd learned too young to be practical instead of hopeful. About Scotland, where she'd always dreamed of visiting. About the poetry she wrote but never showed anyone because vulnerability felt too dangerous. Every detail was precious. Every answer was a gift. 3 months later, winter had settled fully over London, blanketing the city in white. The Merrick townhouse had transformed, not in its physical structure, but in its atmosphere. Laughter echoed in hallways that had known only silence. Warmth filled rooms that had felt like mausoleums. In the music room, Iris sat at the piano while Callum perched beside her on the bench, attempting to learn a simple duet. He hit a wrong note, again, and she laughed, gently correcting his finger placement. Like this. See? He tried again, failed again, and kissed her hand instead of apologizing. The household had noticed the change. Staff moved with lighter steps. Breakfast became a shared ritual, Iris sitting beside Callum instead of across, their conversation easy and genuine. She helped with shipping contracts, turned out she had a brilliant head for business. He read her poetry aloud while she embroidered by firelight. Partnership in every sense. One evening, sorting through social invitations, Iris paused. The Lennox family has invited us to their ball. Callum glanced up from his ledger. Do you want to go? Do you? I don't care about the Lennox family. I never did, really. That was my father's ambition, not mine. Then why did you marry me instead of pursuing that alliance? He set down his pen, reaching for her hand. Because even then, some part of me knew. Knew you were the one I needed. I just had to catch up to what my heart already understood. That's very poetic. I've been reading your Keats. He pulled her into his lap, ignoring her laughing protest. I want to know everything you love. You're everything I love. They sat together in the window seat as snow fell over London, fire crackling behind them, wrapped in the kind of peace that came from choosing each other every day. I almost lost this, Callum murmured against her hair. But you didn't. Because you gave me another chance. Because you finally saw me. He tilted her face up to his. I see you now. I'll see you for the rest of my life. Some marriages begin with love. Theirs began with practicality, with contracts and convenience and the careful distance of two people too afraid to reach for warmth. But what they built, what they chose, was something far more powerful, love earned, love fought for, love that transformed them both. The Merrick townhouse in Mayfair had been built as a monument to duty and dynasty. But love, messy, imperfect, hard-won love, had finally made it a home. If this story stirred something in your heart, if you found yourself holding your breath during Callum's confession or smiling at their hard-won happiness, then you're exactly the kind of person this channel was created for. We craft stories that don't just entertain, but transform. Stories about broken people finding wholeness, about walls crumbling and hearts opening, about love that's earned rather than assumed. Subscribe now, because next week's story might be the one that changes everything for you. Hit that button. Join us. Let's fall into these worlds together.